In this video, I'll be analyzing the D-type positive edge triggered flip-flop. Positive edge triggered flip-flops only change at the rising edge of a clock. At any other point, the output will not change no matter what the data line does. So before the first clock pulse right here, we see our data line is set to 0 and our clock is at 0. But since we know this is a positive edge triggered flip-flop, as long as the clock is at 0, we know the flip-flop is in present state and will not change until a rising edge of the clock. And since the initial gate values are 0, the output will start at 0 and Q bar will be 1 because Q bar is a complement of the output. And we see before the first clock pulse, our data line rises to logic level 1. But since we're not at a rising edge yet, the output is not changed. But once we reach the rising edge, our output changes to 1, our complemented output changes to 0. And this is because the data line was at 1 at the clock's rising edge, therefore putting the circuit in set state. As we approach our second clock pulse, we see that the data line jumps down to 0. When it jumps down to 0, nothing changes because we're not at a rising edge of the clock yet. Therefore, Q will remain at 1 and Q bar will stay at 0. As we approach the rising edge of the second pulse, the data line stays at 0. Therefore, the clock at the rising edge, our output will change. So Q equals 0 and Q bar equals 1. This is because the data line was at 0, putting the circuit in reset state. Now, as we approach our third clock pulse, we see our data line jumps to 1, but nothing happens because we're not at the rising edge of a clock yet. As we continue, we see that the data line jumps back down to logic level 0 before the third pulse's rising edge. Now as we reach the rising edge of the third pulse, the data line is still at 0. Therefore, our output will remain at 0 because the circuit is still in reset state. Now as we approach the fourth clock pulse, the data line remains at 0 until just before it. Data line jumps up to 1. When the data line jumps up to 1, the output does not change because we're not at a rising edge of the clock yet. Once we approach the fourth clock pulse, we hit the rising edge, our data line's still at 1, putting our circuit into the set state. So our output equals 1 and our complemented output equals 0.